In January 1990, preacher Jeffery Lundgren and 12 of his followers were arrested for the murder of a family of 5 in Kirtland, Ohio, a small town near Cleveland. The questions began immediately. Who was he, and why had he done it? Jeffery Lundgren was born in 1950 in Independence, Missouri, the child of strict, very religious parents. He was, for the most part, an unexceptional child.
He was very arrogant, and you just wondered, what does this guy have? What does he think makes him so special?
Author Pete Early researched Jeffery Lundgren's life for a book about the murder of the Avery family. He says what made Lundgren special was a talent he developed early on.
He was excellent at memorizing verses in the Bible, and more importantly, verses in the Book of Mormon. He studied it endlessly because it made him someone who other kids looked up to.
With this skill, Lundgren found a home for himself in his family's religion, the Reorganized Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, or RLDS. It's a small religion of about 250,000 people, now called the Community of Christ, with historical links to the Mormons. Independence is its world headquarters.
We believed in a current-day prophet, but also that God would come back and live on earth. And that place was supposed to be Independence, Missouri.
And this becomes important in Jeffery. They were looking for prophets and open to prophets, where other religions may not have been open to this kind of influence.
In 1969, at Central Missouri State University, Lundgren met a woman willing to believe he was a modern-day prophet. Alice Keeler was also part of the RLDS church. Earlier that year, a church elder had told her she was destined to marry a great church leader.
From the time that was said to me, I think I was always looking and wondering, is this the person? Is this the man? Is this God's will for me?
Soon, 19-year-old Jeffery Lundgren was dominating Alice's life, and she became convinced that he was the man prophesied for her. They began to have sexual intercourse, contrary to church teaching.
He became physically abusive at times, and basically his answer was to me that I had unleashed this force in him and that now I was responsible for taking care of that.
By 1970, Jeffery had flunked out of college, gotten Alice pregnant, and much to his parents' dismay, married her. David Lundgren was the first of what would be their 4 children. Lundgren enlisted in the Navy and was sent to Vietnam, but saw little action. By 1974, he and his growing family had moved back to Independence, Missouri. The 24-year-old couldn't hold a job and often borrowed from his in-laws.
Jeff was using us through Alice and through the children because, you know, the sob story that we don't have a place to live or we don't have any food, and consequently they did use us.
When he couldn't get money there, he stole from his wage jobs, but he never got in serious trouble with the law. One of the only places where Lundgren wasn't a failure was teaching Bible classes in the RLDS church.
You know, he said to me during an interview once, he said, the church is the easiest place to take over. All you have to do is know a few scriptures, and that impresses people, and you can slowly take power and control.
Lundgren's ideas were on the fringe, but he gained followers from the fundamentalist faction of the church. They were disturbed by a movement to have women ordained into the priesthood.
He felt that men were supposed to be in charge, and I believed pretty much along with him that that was an okay thing. That's the way it had always been.
But Lundgren's radical ideas rankled church elders, and in 1984, he was dismissed from teaching Bible classes in Independence. By this time, Lundgren had started telling his wife that God was giving him visions, just like the prophets in the Bible.
He says, I was at Christ's crucifixion. I was at the cross. I saw it. The world melted away, and I was there, and I saw the future. And Alice is just enthralled by this.
Jeff felt that God had revealed to him that we were to move to Kirtland, Ohio. And he really believed that that was his ministry.
Kirtland, Ohio, site of the Kirtland Temple, the first church in the Mormon faith, and a Mecca for RLDS followers. In August 1984, Lundgren moved his family there and took a job at the temple as a guide for visiting pilgrims and tourists. Then as treasurer for the visitors center. To help support his growing family, he started stealing from the gift shop. But Lundgren had his eyes on something bigger and wanted followers other than his wife. Alice Lundgren says her husband had a unique ability to draw vulnerable people to him.
I think Jeff found whatever a person's greatest need or weakness was, and then he portrayed himself as being the person that could provide that need.
Soon, Lundgren was teaching Bible classes in the church, and his message was beginning to grow more radical and mystical. He proclaimed that he was a special prophet who found secret messages in everything from the Book of Mormon to the design of the temple. These messages revealed that Kirtland would be the site of the second coming of Christ.
People really began to come and ask questions and seek him out. I was right there beside him saying, yeah, this is the right stuff. This is really what God wants us to know.
Kevin Curry was one of Jeffery Lundgren's earliest followers. Like many others who would fall into Lundgren's orbit, Curry was a lost soul looking to be led.
I had not had a very solid childhood. This was probably the first time that I felt a part of a family experience.
In February 1985, Curry moved in with the Lundgrens. He was not the only one to make this choice.
Jeffery also shares his news with people back in Independence, folks who knew him then, and he says, this is exciting. I have discovered something. God has told me Jesus is coming to Ohio. You've got to get here. You've got to see this.
Within 2 years, about a dozen people had answered Lundgren's call. Among them were Dennis Avery, an assistant at a bank, his wife Cheryl, and their 3 daughters. They were clearly at the bottom of the group's pecking order.
Jeffery and Alice would tell little stories about the Averys, and they were not very kind towards the Averys at all. They were a family of bookworms, and they were very, very passive kind of individuals.
The biggest crime of the Avery family, according to Jeffery, is that Cheryl, Jeffrey's biggest believer, wears the pants in the family. Dennis does not make her be subservient.
All of Lundgren's followers, especially the half-dozen that came to live in his house, quickly gave up their freedom and began submitting themselves to Lundgren's orders.
Jeffery began to very subtly make hints that he was the head of the household and that I take a role as one of the children. I didn't see any problem with it.
All the adult people that had moved into our home, they did refer to me as Mom.
Lundgren they called Dad. Nearly every night, he subjected them to intense scripture classes.
He said, you know nothing. Everything you ever knew was wrong. Erase your memory and start over and relearn everything. And we thought that it was, okay, this is the right way and we're going to see the Lord.
Every one of Lundgren's followers turned over their paychecks, and in most cases, their earthly possessions to the Lundgrens. Dennis Avery turned $10,000 from the sale of his home back in Independence over to Lundgren. In time, all of them, especially the Averys, would give up far more. Whether he knew it or not, Jeffery Lundgren went by the book when he formed his cult. By having some members live at his house, he was isolating them from the outside world. Through constant mind-numbing Bible classes, he controlled what they were thinking and feeling. While the cult took shape, a conflict was brewing with a new leader at the Kirtland Temple. It was at this point that Lundgren began to tell his disciples that his conversations with God were turning to plans for murder. Kirtland, Ohio. By 1986, Jeffery Lundgren was setting himself up as the leader of a fringe group of fundamentalists at the Temple of the Reorganized Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. He had convinced several devoted followers to join his cult. But then he ran into a threat to his power. In January, the Reverend Dale Luffman was appointed what's called stake president of the Kirtland Temple. After his first Sunday sermon, Luffman checked in on the Bible study groups and was shocked by what he heard coming out of Lundgren's classroom.
I heard as I approached the door, you heard what the stake president had to say today in the sermon, but I want to share with you the truth.
The truth, Luffman heard Lundgren say, meant ignoring the new minister and preparing to face an angry, vengeful God. Luffman waited until class was over, then told Lundgren to meet him in his office the next morning.
My intent was to communicate to him that that was never to ever occur again. It is not appropriate to the Christian gospel to dwell on the wrath without understanding mercy.
In that meeting, Lundgren apologized, but Dale Luffman was worried.
There were people who were buying his recipe, and I was very concerned about how that recipe was getting played out.
A year went by before Lundgren's conflict with the Kirtland Temple leadership became a full-fledged war. In August 1987, church elders discovered that about $20,000 had been embezzled from the Temple Visitors Center. Lundgren was the only suspect. Eager to avoid a scandal, church leaders requested that the disobedient tour guide resign quietly. In return, they would not contact the police. Lundgren agreed to the deal. But the rejection he had suffered at the hands of Dale Luffman reverberated. He took his wife, his children, and 5 of his most devout followers and moved to a farmhouse a few miles from the temple on a former apple orchard. At the same time, the message he was preaching underwent a fundamental shift.
There was a time someplace along the way where he himself came to believe in his own con. And I think it was at that point that he became very dangerous.
In the weeks that followed, Lundgren's plan took shape. Jesus Christ could only come back to earth, he preached, if cult members were willing to, quote, cleanse the vineyard. By cleansing the vineyard, he meant murder.
We were now in the last days.
Lundgren's cousin, Debbie Oliveras, had fled a bad marriage in Independence, Missouri, and joined the cult after it moved to the farm.
Jeff believed that he was to take physical control of the temple.
Lundgren said that God had identified who was to be cleansed in the takeover of the temple, the Reverend Dale Luffman and his family. He even said God had set a date for the sacrifice, the coming spring on Lundgren's 38th birthday, May 3rd, 1988. He had his followers begin practicing military maneuvers and stockpiling weapons, rifles, knives, and automatic pistols.
One Sunday afternoon in particular, Jeff had the men all dressed in their military garb with their weapons. And it was at that point that I realized the magnitude of weapons and ammunition and everything that he had.
The plans, Debbie Oliveras now admits, were horrifying and bizarre. But at the time, she says she could do nothing but embrace the idea of killing the Luffmans and taking over the temple.
Jeff had done such a good job of painting them as evil and vile people that my mind just kind of was registered, oh, okay, whatever. I felt like I was doing what God had created me to do. And so if I was doing that, then I could do no wrong.
Lundgren's wife, Alice, who was her husband's biggest supporter, claims she had reservations about the plan but kept them to herself.
I thought that was pretty outrageous, but I didn't speak out about it either. At the time, I knew that my silence was consent, and I didn't feel like it was safe to speak out about it.
Cult member Kevin Curry was also frightened, but was unwilling to wait and see what happened.
It was obvious that Jeffrey had gone over the line. I was just not willing to take the lives of any innocent individual.
In February 1988, 3 months before the temple takeover was to happen, Curry fled the group. 2 months later, he decided to contact the Kirtland police. But with no evidence beyond the man's strange story, the police could not get a search warrant. Even so, in April 1988, Kirtland's chief of police summoned Lundgren to his office for a chat.
Chief Yarber called in Jeff Lundgren and told Jeff that we had complaints about people in military gear on Jeff's property practicing military maneuvers.
Lundgren denied his group was doing anything wrong and left. The police could not know it, but this meeting helped set Lundgren's cult on his final bloody course. Lundgren went back to his followers and said the temple takeover plan was off.
Jeff said he'd gone to a high place and he'd spoken with God, and that we were in too much of a state of sin for it to happen at that time.
Jeffrey Lundgren had painted himself in the corner. He claimed that he was willing to sacrifice human beings, to shed blood to do this, but he hadn't followed through. This is when Jeffrey switches gears. He gets fixated on eliminating sin from his group.
Then, in September 1988, Dale Luffman excommunicated Jeffrey Lundgren from the RLDS church. This pushed him over the edge. He claimed he had received another vision.
He said that there were people who'd been created that were supposed to be destroyed.
Jeffrey announces that he has been told to eliminate the most sinful members of the group. And in his view, the most sinful members of the group are the Avery family.
Lundgren had ostracized Dennis and Cheryl Avery and their children at every turn. They did not live at the farmhouse and were invited to only one Bible study class a week.
I had already been so led in the direction that they weren't good that at the time it was really hard for me to see them as good anything.
Finally, after months of nervous anticipation, Jeffrey Lundgren announced that the moment had come to cleanse sin from the group. April 17th, 1989. Lundgren had whipped his followers into such a religious frenzy that they were willing to take whatever steps were necessary to ensure what they believed was the return of Jesus Christ.
Part of religion requires a leap of faith. Otherwise, there's no religion. And that opens a door that if you have somebody like Jeffrey taking you through can get pretty scary.
Waiting in the house with the Avery family as they were led one by one out to the barn was Debbie Oliveris.
It never crossed my mind to tell them to run. Never crossed my mind to pick up the phone. It never crossed my mind to walk out the front door and leave. I remember the only two thoughts that went through my mind that night were, if it is happening, it must be God's will. And the other thought was, I'm a sinner and I'll be next.
On the night of April 17th, 1989, in Kirtland, Ohio, preacher Jeffrey Lundgren and his cult murdered 5 of their own members, the Avery family. The next morning at about 10 o'clock, the group was in for a rude awakening.
There was a knock on the door, and it was the Kirtland Police Department and FBI agents.
Kirtland police had involved the FBI in the case of the Lundgren cult 8 months earlier. But until now, there was little either law enforcement agency could do. In the 1970s, guidelines were put in place that forbid the government, and the FBI in particular, from spying on religious and political groups. So when the authorities decided to visit the farm, it was to follow up on information that was long out of date. Lundgren's plans for a takeover of the Kirtland Temple.
We had no probable cause for a search warrant or probable cause for an arrest.
By sheer chance, they had picked the day after the murder of the Avery family to question Jeffery Lundgren and his group about the temple takeover plan. Ron Andelczek was given the task of questioning Lundgren's wife, Alice.
I said, look, for a fact, we know that you're planning the Kirtland Temple takeover. You're doing military training, you're acquiring firearms. And she looked at me and she goes, I'm offended. You're calling me a liar.
I got angry at these guys. I'm thinking, oh my gosh, he killed 5 people last night, and you're asking me about a temple takeover? I just was like, they're not asking the right questions. They're not asking the right questions.
Though Alice knew what the right questions were, neither she nor anyone else in the cult told the authorities what had happened the night before. After 2 hours at the farm, the FBI and police went away frustrated.
We knew something was going on. We couldn't penetrate the control Jeff had over the cult members. When we got back to the station, I checked the list. I noticed nobody had interviewed the Averys. I asked one of the agents from the FBI who interviewed them, and he told me nobody did. We didn't think they were important enough.
It was an unfortunate miscalculation. By nightfall, Lundgren and his followers had disappeared. For Kirtland investigators, the truth of what had happened would not be revealed for 9 months. On December 31st, 1989, cult member Keith Johnson sat down with an agent from the ATF. 4 days later, the bodies of the Avery family were unearthed in the barn on the abandoned apple orchard.
Oh, wait a minute.
After their capture, many cult members, like Lundgren's right-hand man Ron Luff, gave full confessions to their role in the killings. Luff, like most, was so desensitized by his cult experience that his gruesome descriptions lacked any emotion.
And all I saw was the top of the little girl's head when he shot.
They also talked about where they had been since the murders. They said they had headed east until they stopped in West Virginia, in an area Lundgren designated as, quote, the wilderness. There they had camped out and waited for what Lundgren had promised, the second coming of Jesus Christ. But nothing happened, and Lundgren's behavior grew more and more erratic until he and his wife Alice moved with their children to Southern California. At that point, a sad reality began to sink in for most of the cult members.
They felt deceived. They felt betrayed. They felt humiliated. Most of all, they felt terrified. If Jeffrey was a fraud, if what he taught wasn't real, they had helped murder 5 innocent people, including 3 children. And they had to live with that.
Revelations about the murders stunned Kirtland and the surrounding region.
The public sentiment was outrage. It was incensed. They were infuriated by the crime and anyone that was associated with it. They were out for justice, and in this case, justice meant retribution.
Alice Lundgren would be the first to go to trial. Alice's defense team had a challenge ahead of them. The jury heard her video confession made 7 months earlier. One remark about the night of the murders stood out.
Do you recall Jeff asking the Averys to come into town? Did you know what they were being called into town for?
I suspected that it was the sacrifice.
Had he talked to you about that?
Not, yes and no. I mean, it was like, not directly, but indirectly, you'd have to be stupid not to know what he was up to.
Anybody that had been in the circumstances that we had been in would have to be stupid not to have figured it out. I figured it out too late. It was too late for Dennis and Cheryl and Trina and Becky and Karen.
Prosecutors backed up these statements with 3 members of the cult. All had pleaded guilty and were testifying under plea agreements. They told the jury that Alice was her husband's biggest supporter, advocate, and confidant.
We all had our roles, and Alice definitely was given the role of cheerleader. Jeff used her as kind of fuel to fuel the fire.
Debbie Olivares testified that Alice abused her power as the wife of the prophet and that she could have stopped the murders. The main witness to testify for the defense was Alice herself. She claimed that she had no idea her husband was really going to put his plan into action.
The history of Jeff Lundgren is he had historically made threats, and he would threaten to do horrific things to people. He would then get visions from God, which would tell him that the people had learned their lesson, and he would spare them whatever this horrific thing was going to be. Alice thought this was another one of those threats.
The jury didn't accept the explanation. Alice Lundgren was found guilty of complicity to kill, which carries the same punishment as murder. On August 29, 1990, she received a 150-year sentence, meaning she would die in prison. Up next, Jeffery Lundgren's trial, where the state was going for the death penalty. The most memorable part of it wouldn't be anything said by a lawyer, but what came out of the former cult leader's mouth when he had the chance to speak. The capital murder trial of cult leader Jeffery Lundgren began at the courthouse in Paynesville, Ohio, in August 1990. His court-appointed attorneys knew they had no chance to acquit their client. They considered an insanity defense, but their own psychologists said Lundgren was legally sane. So the trial proceeded, and a parade of state witnesses testified. The defense rarely objected or cross-examined, withholding their arguments for sentencing when they would try to save Lundgren's life. For his part, Lundgren showed little interest in his own trial.
He would spend time reading. He would spend time as if he was completely disinterested and disembodied. While we were engaged in earthly justice, he was above earthly justice, was my impression.
DA Steve LaTourette made an impassioned plea to the jury to find Lundgren guilty.
I wish I could be pleasant about it, but I am demanding that you do the job and that you tell Jeffrey Don Lundgren, this fellow right here, that he's guilty. He's guilty of murdering a man, his wife, and 3 children. And he should suffer the consequences.
As expected, Jeffery Lundgren was convicted on 5 counts, each of murder and kidnapping. Now, in the sentencing phase, his attorneys tried to explain why Lundgren committed these crimes and why the jury should spare his life. Their arguments were traditional. Lundgren had strict, overbearing, fundamentalist parents. As a result, they argued, the boy found a negative outlet for his feelings of inadequacy in the RLDS church.
He didn't really have a niche in life. What filled that void, as we attempted to point out, was his religion. This was a religion that freely encouraged revelations. Someone can get swept up in the feeling that they are, in fact, receiving the exact word of God and our prophets.
Paul LaPlante didn't think he had swayed many people on the jury with his arguments. But whatever progress he had made was squelched by what came next. Jeffery Lundgren had requested, as was his right, to make a statement. While Lundgren took full responsibility for the murders of the Avery family, he did not apologize. Instead, for 5 hours, he preached.
I am a prophet of God. I'm even more than a prophet. I am not a false prophet, therefore I am not worthy of the penalty sought by those who seek my death. And it is understandable to me that the legal system has problems with me, a prophet.
It was just so arrogant. I can't even describe what I felt. I mean, if I'd had a gun in the courtroom at that moment in time, I would have used it.
The scriptures teach one is to abhor sin. I did not abhor Mr. Avery as a person, but I abhorred the sin that was in Mr. Avery as I judged it from the record. He was an individual and family that rejected the truth. I cannot say that I'm sorry I did what God commanded me to do in the physical act. I had great sorrow for them before. I have great sorrow for them now.
The jury needed only 3 hours to decide Lundgren's fate. He was sentenced to death. More than a decade later, Jeffery Lundgren waits on Ohio's death row. His execution has yet to be scheduled. He still claims to be God's prophet. Most of Lundgren's followers are also serving time and have long since given up believing in him. Lundgren's former wife, Alice, received one of the harshest punishments of anyone, aside from her husband, even though she wasn't at the farm during the murders. She insists she was as much Lundgren's victim as the others in the cult.
I think Jeff took what was a good and decent faith system and a group of good and decent people and somehow convinced them that what he was saying was God's will.
But Alice has no answer for why she continued to believe what Lundgren was saying, even when his message turned to murder.
I don't know how any of us let it happen to ourselves.
It's not unusual in religion for people to want to call. Here's a guy who believes in visionary experiences. He got so he believed his own rhetoric, to the point where if he didn't pull that trigger, not only would Jeffrey be telling everybody who followed him, I'm a fraud, he'd have to admit it himself. And Jeffery Lundgren was not going to admit that he wasn't a prophet.
Kirtland police officer Ron Andelsek told us that he is thankful Jeffery Lundgren is on death row, because that means he is isolated from the general prison population. He says if Lundgren could maintain absolute control over 20 people out in the world, imagine how many he could control in prison. I'm Bill Curtis. Join me next time for another episode of American Justice.